This webinar will focus on discussion around strengthening M&E practice in Pakistan through capacity and training and capacity building. So our thinking about the use of evidence for policy making in general has been evolving over time. At one point in time, the constraint we consider was the absence or the paucity of evidence and data for policymakers. And of course, the answer to that was obviously the production of more evidence and research, evidence and data for policy making. But slowly we realized that policymakers should also be enabled to and encouraged to use that data and evidence, and focus shifted rather than only from research to building the capacity of these policymakers to commission evidence, to use evidence, or in other words, become more informed users of research evidence. So now the answer was obviously, again, more training and capacity buildings and more training programs at scale. But now, after some years have passed and we have had a number of training programs, now I think the realization is there that it's not just the quantum of training only, but the way it is designed, how well it is designed, how well directed it is, and how customized it is, that will also give us a measure of success and will help us truly build a strong culture of evidence-informed policymaking. There is also this question of that realizing that many efforts, many programs always happen within a context. And that context can constrain us, can help us, and pose barriers to us. And during this webinar, we will be trying to address the question of M&E and how customized, how effective it can be to create the culture of evidence-based policymaking in Pakistan. But we will also be trying to build more sensitivity or understanding of the barriers of that larger ecosystem. Although those questions may, strictly speaking, fall beyond the ambit of this discussion, but for strategic thinking, when we think about M&E, we should also be cognizant of larger systemic barriers to use of evidence. And with these opening remarks, I would like to introduce my worthy panelists for this discussion. For this discussion, we have with us Madam Sara Saeed. Sara Saeed is a BS22 officer, and let me share that she is a record holder, that she is the youngest officer to have been promoted to BS22 in the last 50 years. She is an officer of Pakistan Administrative Services from 23rd Common Training Program. She holds an MSc in Economics from University of Oxford and an MBA from University of the Punjab. During her career, she has held diverse portfolios, including Commercial Secretary, The Hague, Director Policy, National Vocational and Teaching Technical Training Council, Additional Registrar, Supreme Court of Pakistan, Director General Benazir Income Support Program, Director Civil Services Academy, and Secretary Higher Education, Punjab. She has also worked for UK's Department for International Development as Skills Strategy Advisor, and is a trainer for Harvard University's course for public policymakers, which is Building Capacity for Use of Research Evidence. She has been a speaker or trainer at various public and private training and educational institutions, and her special interests include skills, poverty alleviation, development policy and practice, and international trade. And our second panelist is Anam Shoaib. Anam Shoaib is Associate Director, Learning Hub, SERV. Prior to this appointment, Anam was a program manager and helped strengthen the executive education course portfolio. Her niche expertise is curriculum and case study design for a diverse portfolio of training conducted under the executive education vertical at SERV. She has over 10 years of working experience in the development sector as an evaluation expert and manager. Anam has been involved in rigorous academic research, both quantitative and qualitative, for large-scale randomized controlled trial projects, focused on poverty alleviation and social protection programs in collaboration with IGC, British Academy, DFID, and she has led various research projects at SERV with international development organizations like UNDP and World Health Organization. She holds a master's degree in public policy with an international Development Specialization from Duke University, and a BSc Economics from LUMS. So as you can see that our panelists present both sides of the equation. If I talk about Madam Sara, she is a policymaker who has had diverse experience and can bring in the perspective from government side, from the civil service or the users of evidence. And Anam will be bringing the perspective of that part of the whole system which works on creating more evidence and enables use of evidence by creating more knowledge and creating more evidence and data for policymakers. So with this, without further ado, I will welcome my panelists again and hope to have a very fruitful, very productive discussion with them. And with this, my question first to the panelists would be to spend some time on a positive note and start off on a positive note and try to sort of capture for our audience the wonderful, the magnitude and the scale of M&E efforts that we have had with policymakers in Pakistan, which has been enabled by both sides, the government and organizations like SERP and other development sector institutes. So with this, I open the discussion. Before we jump into the discussion, just one last comment for the audience would be that we will have a detailed Q&A session towards the end of this 60-minute webinar. Please hold your questions. You can post them on the Q&A chat box. And once the Q&A session starts, I will be selecting those questions, and you can share your questions after introducing yourselves. So with this, I request Madam Sara Said and Anam to start sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil. I've been associated with SERP, and I think one of the positive developments is that previously training and M&E activities were thought to be a one-off activity. But the fact that my association with SERP is now more than 10 years old is evidence of the fact that, you know, we're moving from just one-off relationships to a bit more durable and long-term relations. So I think that's something that we should really be building upon going further in future and finding more champions on both sides of SERP as well as the government. Talking about M&E, I think we all realize that monitoring and evaluation is a training, is in fact a derived demand of the M&E. So the more the M&E is entrenched and embedded within the government practice, the more there would be a demand for monitoring and evaluation training. And when we talk about M&E activities, we've seen in the past that you know, interest in M&E has waxed and it has waned. Budgets may or may not be present for such activities, but in case that budget is absent, there have been instances where donors have moved in, even if the programs are totally funded by the government. And I think some of the best examples in the past and in some not very distant future are that of the Lady Health Worker Program and the Benazir Income Support Program, social sector programs, both of them having you know, interest from the donors because they were very sharply focused on poverty. And therefore, even though both programs were 100% financed by the government of Pakistan, in both cases, donors showed a great interest in having them evaluated and funded their monitoring and evaluation. In terms of BISP, they had a sort of wide range of monitoring and evaluation activities, both housed within their own organization as well as outsourced. And they were spot checks as well as impact evaluations, and then periodical practices which were followed by the organization itself. So when you look at monitoring and evaluation, it has moved not just from being confined to development projects, but to ministries and divisions. And in the past 10 years, we've seen that whatever the government wanted, it went beyond just directives from the higher post offices. It used to be directives, cabinet decisions, and then we moved on to performance-based budgeting, especially in the field of finance. In the more recent years, performance agreements were signed between the ministries and the government, and then between the ministers and the secretaries. And there came the role of KPIs. People began to understand about what the targets of the government were. And now in the recent government, we've seen the strategic roadmaps. And then side by side, there's also the movement to adopt performance audits. And in most countries, including Pakistan, the National Audit Office has conducted performance audits as well. So there has been more traction on the current spending side as well as the development side. And these processes are now looking increasingly at outputs as well as outcomes. Roadmaps in particular are interesting because they are at the highest level, and they give a stewardship role to the senior political offices, both to the Prime Minister's office and to the ministers' offices here in the federal government at least. When it comes to M&E training, it is of course a function of how strong the M&E function itself is and how strong the demand for it is. But I think it's been a great success that in collaboration with the Center for Economic Research, Pakistan, Pakistan is one of the few countries which have embedded M&E training in the compulsory training for civil servants. And then as we've seen the use of IT more and more in M&E activities itself, for example, in the Planning Commission in Pakistan, we've seen a move towards adoption of dashboards through which continuous monitoring is taking place. The same has happened in Punjab, largely through the Punjab Information Technology Board. The same, the trend of adopting IT and ICT-based technology in technological interventions and innovations in the M&E training, especially delivery, has been quite significant. And recalling what happened in BCure, it was an innovative program which adopted blended learning through ICT. So I think the role of IT has been very strong, and it continues to influence both the M&E training as well as the M&E activities itself. Questions, however, still remain. There have been advancements, but there are barriers still, and we need to, I think, carefully look at them and see how we can find solutions. One of the big questions is the incentives for M&E and M&E training within the public sector. The second one, which is again connected to the incentives, is how do we change the mindsets? They are both connected questions. How do we change mindsets of people who might be willing, but then, because of the time constraints and resource constraints in some cases, they are unable to indulge in monitoring and evaluation activities as well as monitoring and evaluation related capacity building. And I would like to delve more upon the third aspect, which I consider as a barrier when it comes to both M&E and M&E training, is demonstrating benefits. How do we actually complete the loop when we are conducting monitoring and evaluation training so that the demand actually becomes more and more organic and not just emanating from external sources. So over to you, Anam.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Adil. I think I'm going to speak a little bit about sort of the derived demand for M&E that Sarah touched upon, and whether or not that is being adequately supplied by the other side, which is, whether these are, educational institutes, training service providers, policy think tanks. And I do think that over the last decade or so, there has been a very slow but a very positive move towards curating and designing newer capacity building programs to address this derived demand that is coming from within the government. So we have institutions such as SDPI, PIDE, we have universities like LUMS and IBA creating these courses and sort of filling this and fulfilling this unmet demand. And like Sarah mentioned, I think we have policy think tanks and research institutions like IDEAS and SERP, which are spearheading some of the more unique training programs. So for instance, the BQ training program that Sarah just mentioned is a collaboration between SERP and EPOD at Harvard. And so far till date, in the last decade or so, has successfully trained almost 6,000 civil servants across Pakistan. So that we're talking about all 4 provinces within the country. And more than that, I think over the past few years, we have also developed other courses like our EBPD courses, which is evidence-based policy design course, which is, targeted towards this idea, which Sarah also mentioned, that in terms of sort of demonstrating the benefit of this program, the program basically takes participants through this very enriching process that it starts from the diagnosis of a policy problem and then sort of ends with impact evaluation that allows the government to understand whether investment of funds is being done correctly or not. And obviously for any country, but particularly for developing countries which are already sort of operating under a severe budget constraint, these are important policy questions to think about, whether we're sort of spending our monetary resources in the right manner or not. We also have over the past few years seen that there have been monitoring and evaluation boot camps. So there's an M&E boot camp, for instance, that SERP has launched, tailored for the government and their need, and whether that is specifically targeted, say, towards the Planning and Development Department in Sindh or the Federal Planning Commission. These M&E boot camps basically target particular areas of opportunities where learning can be maximized. So for instance, if governments feel that they need M&E training to allow them to make better PC1s or to allow them to make better PC3s, which are basically performers that the Planning Commission uses in the monitoring and evaluation process of a project cycle, then that is something that, organizations like SERP are trying to build upon. So sort of doing a proper thorough needs assessment when sort of working with the government to identify areas where they need more capacity building on. So I would think that also in some ways acts as an incentive for the government, that rather than offering them generic training programs, we're basically catering to their very specific training needs. And that has in the past been received very well within, the provincial government as well as the federal government, and definitely seems to be the way ahead when it comes to capacity building. The third thing I would like to mention here is that over the past couple of years, I think the organic demand from within the government is also towards thematic training. So rather than having generalized monitoring and evaluation training, the government now wants us to think about monitoring and evaluation within the climate change crisis in Pakistan, or within, say, the energy crisis in Pakistan. So just a couple of weeks back, SERP basically in collaboration with Princeton University launched a workshop around Pakistan's challenges as it's navigating the energy transition. And one of the novelty factors of that event was that we invited not just, individuals from, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Climate Change, but also private sector stakeholders who are working within the energy sector. So these kind of capacity building platforms that allow this synergy between the private and the public sector also allows for a lot of learning to take place, which I think is also sometimes missing when we think about capacity building, or when we think about, oh, this is just a one-off training. These workshops and these events can then sort of conclude with some very concrete projects that come out of these, networking events, these training platforms that are, being provided by organizations like SERP.
Thank you. And I think you have touched upon a very important aspect of this discussion, that is customizing these trainings and which segment to target. But I would like to request Madam Sarah also to share her thoughts about the idea that, or the question that how should we customize these trainings? First of all, for example, I would like her to share her thoughts about the question whether this M&E training and capacity building effort should be targeted for the top leadership or for the more technical and support staff who need those skills and technical tools to create that data and create that evidence for decision making by the top leadership. And since I'm talking, so I would like to pose another question within this, because that is also related, which is that when we try to build this coalition around M&E training and capacity building and build a strong case for M&E and evidence-based decision making, do you think that we should also consider targeting not just the official executive, the civil service as per se, but also the elected executive, people who are part of legislature, or people who are part of the cabinet, ministers? Should we also try to focus our training efforts on people who are vested with making decisions and who come from political side and are in office for a short duration as compared to the people who are from the civil service but have more accountability from the grassroots level?
I think the demand for M&E, the most important source for that would be the political leadership, and then the top leadership in any organization. When you talk about civil servants, it is those who are heading an organization. And trainings traditionally have focused more on civil service, on technical people within an organization. But increasingly now, with outsourcing available and training in basic data analysis, you have in-house resources for carrying out basic M&E, but the more sophisticated, rigorous type of impact evaluations could always be outsourced. What is needed is the ability to interpret those results in the top leadership. But as you know, success has many friends and failures has none. It is important to understand that, you know, once an evaluation gives positive results and positive outcomes are reported, they'll be, you know, very eagerly flashed in the media. But evaluations can also be negative and point towards the need to totally scrap a program or to drastically redesign it. So in that case, I think the role of the parliament is very important. Traditionally, parliaments are there to approve budgets and also ask the government where it has spent those budgets. But linked to that is the question of whether a certain program has been successful or not. And I think the most potent voice to ask that can come from parliaments, especially from the standing committees, which are there for accountability. In the case of Pakistan, if we look at the system that our Senate and National Assembly follows, in the past few years, they have also become quite open in terms of at least the kind of questions they pose from the government, and their reports are also now being published regularly. So there are question times in the parliament. These standing committees pose questions to ministries, and the secretaries are required to personally appear in each of these sessions and respond to the queries by the parliamentarians. So it is important to let the public know that there are people in the parliament who can raise questions on their behalf. These questions mostly up till now have been related to the inputs. They ask how much has been spent on such and such program. What has been, if there has been any reported corruption in the implementation of the program. But very little discourse has been on the actual results of a program. And I think sensitizing the parliamentarians to you know, this idea of properly conducting evaluations, finding out whether repeated investments in the same area, whether they are worth it or not, is something that should be looked into and is really, I think, worth investing in when it comes to totally hands-off independent evaluation and discussions on how to go about development, how to design good social protection programs, what areas to support the businessmen in. For example, let me give you the case of incentives that the government has time and again been given to businessmen. It is now, I think, increasingly the demand from within government as well as from outside it to ask what has happened, whether, you know, a certain tax cut given to the, say, textile sector, has it resulted in any demonstrable increase in exports? And these questions are being asked. The more, you know, these are asked at the appropriate level, the more the demand for M&E is going to be, and therefore then this would lead to more activity on the training side as well.
Thank you, Sarah. I would just like to add a few points here as far as, you know, Adil, your question was concerned, with Sarah also sort of touched upon. I definitely agree that I think it should definitely be targeting parliamentarians and civil society. And, you know, there are lots of voluntary evaluation organizations within Pakistan. I think they also have a very active role to play to sort of exert that kind of accountability pressure that, you know, we want to see whether programs actually have a long-term impact and where, you know, sort of taxpayer money is being spent as far as policy issues and, you know, development projects are concerned. But one thing that I would like to also sort of highlight is that, say, within a government, when we sort of design training programs, we try and target both the top leadership as well as those officers who are going to be conducting monitoring and evaluation on the ground. Because obviously building their technical capacity is equally important, but so is sort of making sure that the top leadership understands the importance of investing in monitoring and evaluation and of conducting monitoring and evaluation to develop better programs, better policies. And I think if there is a buy-in from the top leadership and they sort of own this idea that, yes, monitoring and evaluation needs to be given the importance and the value that it is being given, say, in other developed countries where monitoring and evaluation is an embedded function of most programs, then slowly and gradually, we will see that there is also a resource investment being done in M&E wings where capacity building is then coupled with, say, like Sarah mentioned, you know, the development of data dashboards, which today, in today's day and age, are equally important to ensure, okay, agar, you know, if you're doing monitoring of a large scale, say, infrastructure project, then monitoring can't be done by, you know, going there in person, manually doing all of those things, manually entering all of that monitoring data and developing indicators. A lot of that will then have to be synthesized through these softwares, through these data dashboards that, you know, I think within Pakistan, the governments are sort of slowly recognizing the importance of. And I think one of the efforts which I would like to highlight here over the past few years, it's organizations like SERP have done, is to gather, you know, parliamentarians and politicians and, you know, leaders of important institutions within Pakistan and like summit style I-lead training workshops that allow them to understand why evidence is important for policy making. Because at the end of the day, the monitoring and evaluation framework that we keep talking about in capacity building programs is underpinned by this idea that evidence and data collection is very, very important to be able to sort of dissect whether a project has had a causal impact as far as the intended outcomes are concerned. And like Sarah is saying, obviously there is a political inertia that, you know, politicians or policymakers are a little hesitant that what if, you know, impact evaluation goes on to show that there has been no impact of a policy. And that is something that, you know, we have to make politicians understand is part of the process, because monitoring and evaluation is not a very static concept. It's a dynamic framework. You need to iterate policy making until you create a program that sort of, you know, delivers and has an impact. So over to you, Adil.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. Yes, I think partly maybe building on what you said, that we have some inherent challenges to work around. For example, sometimes many activities do not produce results quickly enough for policymakers to to have that evidence to make a decision. And sometimes the constraint is to make a decision without waiting further because situation is changing. Something that organizations like SERV and other academics and people who are from M&E field should be thinking about. Maybe we should work around this barrier and try to create evidence in real time, which is more readily usable by the policymakers. But coming back to our discussion earlier, another question which I had for you both was, and especially for Sarah, because I have seen these BQ trainings and some of these M&E trainings, and it appears that when an M&E training is happening within the government context, there is the cohort is quite diverse. People from different occupational groups and different departments are there. And some of them, I think, are coming from a background where there could be more opportunities for use of evidence, and some departments or agencies are such that where the use of evidence is not that obvious. Do you agree with that thought? And do you suggest that there is some, if I could use the term, low-hanging fruit in terms of identifying and targeting certain ministries, divisions, or agencies which could be more fertile grounds for targeting M&E efforts, and try to build more demonstrable case studies for the other departments to follow, and to see that, look, this certain department used evidence and they produced wonderful results or good enough results and we can emulate. So do you think that is a fair thought to have? And would you try to delve on the types of departments or ministries which could be more open and more friendly towards use of evidence?
Adil, one would tend to think that, maybe M&E is needed more in development sectors and not in the ministries or organizations which are doing everyday work of the government. But you'll be surprised to know that when we interacted in the case of BCure with organizations such as the police or the post office, even there, they came up with a lot of examples, a lot of initiatives in which they tried to improve the motivation of their workers. They tried to improve the reporting of certain crimes and tried to give incentives, and were looking at the results. That I think that notion that M&E is restricted to only a few is not tenable. M&E needs to be applied, and the principles need to be applied everywhere, not just in projects, not just in one-off initiatives, but also to the continuous working of an organization for it to improve. Having said that, I think in certain cases, like for example, infrastructure, the tools for M&E are quite routine type of tools. They're looking more at physical progress of, say, a road or any other piece of infrastructure where the evidence is visible, not in terms of quality, but at least in terms of what has been built. So perhaps if more rigorous type of evaluations are to be conducted, I think the social sector is more ripe for that. And it's the opportunities are there. Government is, of course, multi-tiered in our case. And it's surprising to know that the kind of work which is done in one province or in one locality or in one city tends to be restricted towards that locality alone. So I think when we talk about improvement, how to improve and how to get more out of our limited resources, it is important to keep on sharing positive examples from evaluation activities carried out in one province and to bring them to the federal level or to another province. So that I think is something that is needed, and otherwise I don't believe in restricting the notion of MNE to any particular ministry or any particular sector.
And I would just like to add that, like, Sarah mentioned that, she was surprised to hear how departments like the police department or the post office department were able to sort of use some of the learnings from BQ to improve some of their day-to-day processes. Similarly, I think when it even comes to, say, infrastructure projects, say, if, the government is building a road, I think it is now time to move beyond just the physical monitoring of an infrastructure project and to think about what are the social repercussions, what are the environmental impact of such projects. If people, how have they been impacted if, a road has been constructed, say, in between a village or in between an area where a community was residing. And now, obviously, there have been a lot of studies being done that infrastructure projects have a very high cost that the environment has to bear. And obviously that then has repercussions on the civilians. So we can take the example of, the sort of increasing levels of smog and the deteriorating air quality in Lahore in the past couple of years that has, impacted the local person, the local man. So I think these are questions that, the government should be thinking about. And again, as organizations who are developing capacity building programs, we definitely want to focus on such things also. And like Sarah is saying, I absolutely agree that I don't think there's any one particular ministry which requires M&E, because if you think about evidence-driven decision-making or evidence-driven M&E, then that should apply to all departments within the state's machinery.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you for your thoughts. Moving on, so for M&E efforts, if you look at these, we tend to think it's not maybe it's a cynical thought, but I would like both of you to address it at some length. That if we think about M&E and training, M&E training and capacity building efforts, sometimes it appears that it is more like supply driven or donor driven. What are your thoughts about what are the barriers which, if it is true, what are the barriers in making it otherwise, that it becomes more organic and demand driven, that there is a demand from the government side or the policymaker side for more evidence and more training to create that knowledge and evidence for decision making? Number one. And number two, and if we look at M&E's current training portfolio, is there some unmet demand from the policymaker side, which M&E training efforts have so far been missing? Would you like to highlight any of those training areas which we have sort of ignored or not paid enough attention to so far? So please.
Thank you, Adil, for bringing up this very important question. I would like to suggest that we, use the framework of theory of change to understand the problem. And in theory of change, you have different links to the chain, and you align all the results and, see what you're expecting in the end. So if we look at M&E training, I think by investing in M&E training, we are, the next step we are expecting is that M&E itself would take place. So from M&E training to M&E interventions. And then from M&E interventions, you expect to have results from M&E. Now, where do we go after that? After that, you need to show that these results are being used and that these inputs are being used to design better programs, so as the learning loop is complete. So I think it's very important to demonstrate that whatever we are investing in M&E training is leading to something tangible, and there are demonstrable results to cash, and the benefits are there. So I think you need to show that there are benefits which won't be realized unless you carry out these M&E activities and they lead to better design. So I would call it latent demand. You need to show results, you need to show benefits of M&E training for this demand to come forward and to be, vocalized. In terms of improving the current offerings of monitoring and evaluation capacity building programs, moving from this framework, I think in terms of content, we need to probably add positive examples from our own body of experience and learning of what needs to be shared. I've noticed in the case of provincial government and the federal government, when I was moving from the province to the federation, that there has been important work in Punjab in the area of skills development, which is little known in the National Vocational and Technical Training Council in the center. So if you're able to show that this is what PSDF did, Punjab Skill Development Fund, this is how they undertook their monitoring and evaluation activity, and this is how they were able to, reap the benefits of that M&E through better design, and then you show it to NAVTTC, I think it'll be useful content. So in terms of content of the training, M&E training program, I think positive examples need to figure in very clearly and very strongly so that they clearly see the need for M&E and the latent demand gets translated or transformed as effective demand in economic terms, as we say. The second intervention I think we need to make in the current offerings is perhaps more IT-based programs which enable professionals to learn at their own pace. So self-paced programs when it comes to delivery, they can be tested again, because our motto is to test and evaluate to see whether the physical programs get more traction, whether you're able to generate more demand through physical training or through innovative IT-based self-paced programs offered to professionals. The third thing to ponder upon is perhaps certification.
Yeah.
Maybe we haven't thought much about the certification part in M&E. In project management, there are different types of certifications. PMP is one example. Maybe something for the M&E professionals, for them to not only be trained, but and to signal that they are professionals, they understand. But I think these certifications will give a sense of pride and a sense of ownership, and be helpful also in forming a community of people who can share their experiences and launch some maybe virtual platforms for the experts. So these are my thoughts on how the current offerings that we have can be improved.
And so I would just like to add that I think it's quite interesting that when we talk about capacity building trainings, which revolve around monitoring and evaluation, then a more fundamental or basic question would be that, are we even measuring the impact of these trainings? Because like Sarah mentioned, we need to show whether there are tangible benefits of being trained through these workshops and these events. And so one of the things that we have done at SERP is now to measure whether these trainings have impact on the technical skills of the participants. So we measure the learning outcomes. And there definitely has been a very statistically significant difference in their sort of technical skills prior to the training and after the training. And I think the idea of a certification sounds great, because not only does that provide like the sort of non-monetary incentive that, you have a certification from, say, an organization like SERP, which is sort of globally renowned and gives you that sense of achievement and pride. But also, I think trainings cannot just be a one-off event. You need to have like a series of capacity building events that allow these individuals to continually improve upon the skills that they've acquired and how they can use them in their actual day-to-day work. The third thing I would mention is the POP, the PSDF example that Sarah mentioned. So I was fortunate enough to be part of the evaluation team that was working on POP back in 2011, 2012. And it's a very fascinating project if you think about it, because when POP was launched in collaboration with PSDF and SERP in Southern Punjab, the first intervention, quote unquote, failed because the uptake was really low. But that didn't mean that PSDF basically scratched the program. The SERP researchers went back into the field to investigate, to gather more evidence and information as to why the program failed, right? And they then sort of continually, through a very iterative process, tweak the design of the program until they sort of saw that there has been impact on, skill building or, the vocational training demand in Southern Punjab, whether that was for males or for females. So it was a process that involved both the government's willingness to do that, but also, the researchers came in who had sort of that technical capability to be able to gather that evidence. And so that, I think, is a wonderful case study, which shows that this sort of gap between research or evidence and policy making can definitely be bridged, right? And it's not something that happens overnight. It was a very long project. I think it just ended or is still in the process of being wrapped up. I think the academic papers and the policy briefs are still being written as we speak. But again, like Sarah said, I think knowledge products need to be built upon. So whether these are provincial projects or whether these are federal projects, if there are learnings from their M&E work, those need to be made into case studies, and then, like Sarah is saying, should be circulated and studied by policymakers, so that rather than sort of reinventing the wheel and starting from scratch, you learn from previous projects. And that is something that we try to do in our capacity building projects also, that rather than just sort of teaching them concepts or frameworks, we link them to actual policy programs. Some of those have failed, some of them have been successful, but what are the learnings, what are the lessons, what are the opportunities for now the policymakers who are now in power to be able to make those decisions?
Yeah, so the change is happening, improvement is there, but maybe not at the pace that we would like to see. Progress is always painfully slow, we all understand that. One sort of humbling thought in this is that sometimes we have very important studies which show impact of an intervention, but somehow do not translate into policy impact for some reason or another. I would like to now shift to in the time that we have before Q&A, maybe next 5 or 6 minutes. We discussed the M&E training and capacity building efforts within the larger ecosystem and the context that we have to consider at times, that we have brilliant professionals in the civil service, we have brilliant M&E professionals, but sometimes we have impact, but sometimes we don't. What are the barriers? Because at the end of the day, these are the civil servants or the policy makers who have to use that research evidence and are in real decision-making position, impact-making position. How can we sort of address, and first of all, what are the barriers to using research evidence? Even in the case of people who are well-versed with M&E tools, they understand the language, they understand the need, but are somehow unable or somehow are not enabled to use evidence-based decision-making in their policy making. So I would request Madam Sarah, from her very long and illustrious career and experience, to share with us why this is the case and what are the key barriers. And even when we cannot do much about it, at least understanding these barriers would help us think strategically and design policy interventions in future. So first, Madam Sarah, please go ahead. I'd like to listen to you, and then Anam, you can come and respond on that. Thank you.
Well, I think we spoke about political will. If you look at our political structure, not just ours, but all over the world, the governments here have a certain time period in office, from 5 years, 4 years, to maybe if they've got 2 terms, then it's 10 years. So within a limited time period, they have to deliver. And the pressure on civil service as well as on the government machinery is to deliver within a certain span of time. Responsiveness is considered very important. And responsiveness, the degree of responsiveness has many interpretations. In some cases, if the government articulates that it wants a certain outcome, smart advisors or civil servants would build a case for more and more evidence and to be able to establish the design of a program on firm footing and on good evidence. But in certain cases, they may or may not be heard. So I think political will to establish evidence as an important factor is important. I sometimes have pondered and looked at, other country examples. For example, if you look at the case of the United States, for every regulatory change that the government intends to put in place, there has to be a cost benefit analysis done, and that cost benefit analysis has to be published. And then the comments have to be invited. In case of Pakistan, we have a similar requirement for environmental impact assessments. They are institutionalized by virtue of laws. We have systems in place through which the development projects need to have ex ante cost benefit analysis. The ex post impact evaluations or cost benefits are conducted, but only for mega projects. So I think there has to be sufficient political will, which either translates into directions or perhaps a law, which institutionalizes the need to carry out monitoring and evaluation, and especially impact evaluations of large projects. That is something which needs to overcome the pressure for immediate delivery or responsiveness. So coming from the perspective of civil servant, I think gaining time for the system to be able to gather evidence and present it in an intelligible form is important, and needs to be realized and institutionalized through systems and requirements.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Anam, do you have any thoughts to offer on this?
Sure. I think Sara touched upon this earlier also, that I think time and resource constraints are two of the main barriers, I feel, which sort of hinder M&E to operationalize in government departments. And time in particular, because say if you want to improve the educational landscape in Punjab and you build 100 schools, you can immediately say, oh, we've built 100 schools. But to be able to measure the impact of these schools on learning outcomes, on students' attendance, on sort of their long-term outcomes is something that takes time to gather that evidence, and also just naturally that a year down the line, 2 years down the line, you will be able to measure the impact of how well a school has done in terms of a lot of these indicators that I've just mentioned. So time and resource constraint, I definitely think, are the two main binding factors that hinder the government.
So thank you. With this, I think we are nearing the end of our time for the webinar, and in the next we can use next 5 or 6 minutes for opening the session for opening for Q&A, and we request the audience to write any questions they have in the Q&A chat box, and we can address those questions one by one. Okay, so one of the questions that we have from our audience is from Khalid Hussain. His question is, what are the common challenges of M&E and how we ensure proper or useful M&E? I think the question is more focused on the operational part of M&E. For example, when M&E projects are being run, what are the common pitfalls that cause an M&E program to sort of derail and not get done on time and produce verifiable results and good quality evidence?
Well, I think if I'm allowed to go first.
Yeah, sure, please.
You can imagine I think it's called in project parlance, the work breakdown structure. So at every point, every node in the work breakdown structure has its own challenges. Even the design of M&E, if you think of designing the design phase, even that has a lot of challenges. I recall the Punjab Skill Development Fund program, and when its M&E was being designed, there was a lot of debate on the sample size, and sample size appeared to be, a big challenge because the researchers wanted to have a larger sample compared to the implementers who wanted quick results. So a compromise had to be struck. And the same goes for, say, for example, if you're having a rigorous evaluation, there are challenges of having a control group. So I think at each and every node, each and every point, there are multiple challenges. But if you look at the starting point, I think the biggest challenge to overcome is actually the need to bring people on board, the right people on board, who own the process, who have faith in the process, and are willing to use the results from the M&E to improve upon whatever they're doing in the government. So I think changing mindsets is the most important challenge and barrier, because there may always be new challenges, new evaluation questions thrown up, which might pose serious problems to important government investments, and they need to be tackled in a systematic manner. But then the right kind of mindset and attitude would lead to patience to bear the technical processes and the time that is needed to go through those processes and wait for the results so that better design can be achieved.
Yeah, thank you. And Anam, do you want to answer this? Or should
I just want to add that, when Sarah mentioned this there was almost a deadlock when we were talking about this POP, PSDF project, when, there was some sort of debate happening on sample size. And I think one of the things that should also be part of capacity building programs when we're thinking about technical skills is also soft skills of coalition building.
Yeah.
Because it's not just policymakers who are making these policies, they have to work with other departments who are gathering evidence, other policy think tanks. So softer skill building is, I think, an important part also. So for instance, SERP has its policy skills and leadership training that is particularly meant to focus on these sort of softer skills of exercising leadership, of how to build coalitions. And the second thing I would say is that in most government programs, M&E is done, evaluation is done after a program has ended. So ex post evaluation, whereas evaluation needs to be embedded in the design of the project. So that as the project is being implemented and rolled out and you're monitoring its progress and you're evaluating certain, midline outcomes or outputs, if there is an issue that you identify there and then, you go back to the design of the program and you sort of tweak it and iterate it, so that rather than having to implement a program and after 2 years realizing, the evaluation yielded no results, you can use that data in real time to be able to improve a program, and it's the way it has been designed.
If I may add something, I think it's very important to realize that, M&E is there for improvement. And if it's done only at the end of the program, then you've lost the opportunity, at least to the extent of that program. And I remember that the director of SERP uh, repeatedly, said this, that skill development programs are known to have a very bad reputation, at least within the World Bank. So the reason was that all those programs were previously designed without any flexibility to redesign. And that actually meant going back to the different decision-making fora and getting approvals again and again. So it is important, I think, it is important barrier that programs are, once they're designed and they are approved, they are presented as FATA comply. And at least at the implementation stage, there is very little flexibility to change them. So I think there are certain design elements like funds which allow that kind of flexibility, where you have a certain pool of money and people come, and then the design is actually dictated by evidence and continuously feeds into new and new design elements. So I think it is something to think about when it comes to designing programs and launching new ones, that the M&E, even if it is mid-course, it allows for mid-course correction, and that there's sufficient time left to introduce these new elements coming from the M&E.
This is great. Thank you for your thoughts, Sarah and Anam. We have one more question from Adil Aziz, who is asking that SERP and many other organizations and researchers are creating a lot of data and research evidence. How can we make this data and research evidence more accessible to policymakers? I think this would relate to more towards the dissemination part of the end results of the data of the research projects or M&E efforts, but also tries to point to the fact that there is so much data which is being created, but it is not made use of. And I would like to add to this that at times we have seen that even the governments and their administrative units are also creating a lot of administrative data which is not being readily put to use at times. So how can we utilize the data that we already have and is being generated by other organizations like SERP?
If you look at it from the point of view of civil servants and the government, I think there's a lot of benefit in forging partnerships and in bringing similar organizations together on one platform. So forming, I believe, network of organizations and letting them share what they've learned through their research evidence. I can think of, when we talk about skills, I can think of the Sindh TEVTA, the Punjab TEVTA, the National Vocational and Technical Education Commission, the Punjab Skill Development Fund. Many, there's a plethora of skill development programs all across government at different levels. Bringing them together and making them share research evidence, especially from their M&E activities, I think is something which can lead to better designed programs. And that is something which needs to happen more often, perhaps a role that SERP can play now that one major M&E program, the POP program, is coming to an end. There can be more effort in disseminating research evidence, not just to the government of Punjab, but also to stakeholders from other governments and even NGOs.
Thank you. I think we have gone over time, but this was a very important topic, and we could go on for some more time, but we have to stop here. It was a great discussion over 60 or so minutes, and we can go on, but we have to stop here. And I would like to thank both the panelists, Madam Sarah Saeed and Anam Shoaib, for being on the panel and answering key questions around M&E how MNE is taking roots within the Pakistan's policy-making setup. What are the barriers, how we can overcome them, what is the ground that we have covered so far. And very important thoughts that that came up were, some of them were that all the departments and ministries can use evidence. It's not confined to a certain ministry or unit, which is more amenable to the use of research and evidence. So this is a myth that needs to be taken care of. And one important point that Anam shared was that perhaps alongside technical skills, we should also focus on coalition building skills, the other soft skills and political skills for civil servants and other MNE professionals to actually create that space for MNE and evidence-based decision making. With this, I thank everyone who was with us as participants of the webinar. I hope you enjoyed this. And before logging off, I would request you all to answer a quick poll that will be shared with you during the webinar. And you can share your feedback. I think you can see it on your screens now. So with this, while you are filling out this feedback form, I will stop here and thank once again Madam Sarah for taking out time from her very busy schedule. I know that she is super busy these days, and Anam Shoaib as well, who took out time to be part of the panel. Thank you both. Thank you very much.